When we talk about college students, we usually picture academics, social life, all that stuff about future careers. But what about the invisible burdens they're carrying every single day? Today, we're going to take a look inside that invisible backpack and unpack the real weight of student distress piece by piece.
So let's just start with a number that really sets the stage: 30%. That's how many students who walk into a college counseling center for help have a history of self-injury or suicidal behavior. This is not some small fringe group. It's a huge number of students arriving on campus already in a state of severe distress.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll dig into the clinical crisis these students are up against. Then, we're going to add another heavy item to their backpack: financial anxiety. After that, we'll see how these two huge problems overlap and make each other worse. And finally, we'll talk about what universities can actually do to help lighten that load.
Okay, so let's start with that clinical weight. We're not just talking about students feeling the usual stress of exams and deadlines. For a lot of them, they're managing really complex mental health challenges that began way before they ever set foot on campus.
Just look at their starting line. This data from the Center for Collegiate Mental Health is pretty stark. It shows that students with that history of suicidal or self-injurious behaviors, we'll just call it S/SIB, they walk into counseling carrying a much, much heavier burden. Their average levels of distress from things like depression and anxiety are way higher than their peers. They're basically starting from a much tougher place.
And here's the thing: it's almost never just one issue. That initial distress, it's usually just one part of a much bigger, more tangled web of problems. These students are carrying a backpack that is just stuffed with interconnected challenges.
So how complex are we talking? Well, compared to other students in counseling, those with an S/SIB history are almost 15 times more likely to also be dealing with self-injurious thoughts. They're over 4 times more likely to struggle with mood instability or even psychotic symptoms. This is not a single isolated problem. It's a whole cascade of severe issues happening at once, and that requires some seriously specialized care.
And that leads to a really tough question. What happens when these students are actively getting help? Does the risk just go away? Well, how much higher do you think it is? It's 11.6 times more likely. I mean, that is a staggering number. It just highlights how incredibly vulnerable this group is and the immense pressure on campus counseling centers to give them the intensive, round-the-clock support they need. The stakes are just unbelievably high.
But, mental health doesn't happen in a bubble. So now we have to add another really heavy burden to that invisible backpack: the constant grinding stress of money. And when researchers talk about financial anxiety, they don't just mean worrying about bills. They mean a condition with real physical symptoms. Symptoms that look an awful lot like a clinical anxiety disorder. We're talking muscle tension, being irritable all the time, losing sleep, all because of money stress.
So you might think the answer here is pretty obvious, right? Student loans, credit card debt. But what does the actual research say is the #1 biggest predictor of this kind of anxiety?
Turns out it's not the actual dollar amount of debt, it's the student's feeling about their money, their level of financial satisfaction, basically how they feel about their situation. That is the most powerful sign of how anxious they're going to be. And this is a really surprising discovery. Yeah, student loans are part of it, but they weren't the main thing driving anxiety during college. The research suggests that the real, full-blown panic about debt, that might not even kick in until after graduation. For students actually on campus, it's that day-to-day feeling of, am I going to make it, that matters the most.
Okay, so now we have these two huge weights: a serious clinical history and this deep financial anxiety. But they're not sitting in separate pockets of the backpack. No way. They're pressing down on each other, making the whole load feel that much heavier.
And this is really the key to understanding the whole situation. The clinical stuff and the financial stuff, they are deeply connected. They create this compounding effect that can be absolutely crushing for a student. The data makes this link crystal clear. Look at this. The CCMH report shows that students with a history of S/SIB are not only more likely to have experienced trauma, they are way more likely to report being financially stressed. We're talking over 37% of them, compared to less than 22% of their peers in counseling. The connection is right there.
So when you put it all together, a history of severe mental health challenges, plus the constant grinding pressure of not knowing if you can pay your bills, the true weight of that invisible backpack, well, it finally comes into focus. It's an absolutely enormous load for anyone to carry, let alone a student just trying to get through their classes.
So what on earth can be done? The good news is the research also points to solutions, and it highlights the absolutely critical role that a well-funded, well-resourced campus support system can play in helping students manage all this weight.
Okay, first, we just have to admit that these at-risk students need more help, plain and simple. On average, they use 15% more services. But more importantly, they need specialized kinds of care, like case management to help them navigate all the different campus offices, and psychiatric services for medication. Just talk therapy often isn't going to cut.
But here's the massive problem. There is a huge gap between what students need and what's actually available. Almost 60% of university counseling centers don't have a dedicated case manager. A similar number don't offer any psychiatric care. So the very services these high-risk students need the most are the ones that are most likely to be missing.
So, the CCMH report lays out a pretty clear roadmap. 1. Invest in comprehensive care that's right there on campus. 2. Build bridges so counseling can actually work with the financial aid office and others. And 3. Probably the most important, align your funding with how complex student needs actually are today.
And this really requires a massive shift in how universities think. Instead of just asking, how many counselors can we afford, they need to start asking a better question, what level of service do we want to provide for our students? And then figure out the staffing from there. It's a switch from thinking about headcount to thinking about capability.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's this. Just treating the symptoms of anxiety or depression in the therapy office is not enough. For support to actually work, it has to be holistic. It has to address the underlying stressors, like financial insecurity, that are weighing these students down in the first place.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. In this new era of really complex, overlapping crises, are our universities and colleges actually prepared to support the whole student, their mental health, their financial stability, their total well-being, and not just the part of them that sits in a classroom?